Okay, last one. More operating controls. Um, some of the newer transceivers, handheld or base stations, support what we call digital voice mode. Uh, there's essentially three main ones. There's DMR for digital mobile radio. Most of the Chinese radios, if they support digital mode, support DMR. ICOM and Kenwood support D-Star. Yaesu supports System Fusion. Uh, at this point, they're not really interoperable. So if you got a Yaesu radio, you can only do digital voice to a Yaesu repeater.
Hmm.
Likewise, if you've got a Kenwood or an ICOM, you can only talk to, I don't know, does Kenwood make repeaters?
I don't
Talk to an ICOM repeater that's D-Star.
or another D-Star.
Or another
direct.
handheld, and you can do simplex with digital voice without a repeater. But those are the three most popular. When you get into, they all can have gateways to connect to the internet, which allows you to talk to another repeater somewhere else in the world via the internet. Now there's some, not sure they call them gateways. There's some things you can configure to actually get from, say, DMR to D-Star. I don't know how to do it, never tried, but apparently that can be done through the internet. And that's one of the reasons that the digital modes are somewhat popular, is because of routing signals through the internet. You can basically get anywhere in the world. It's not dependent on propagation. All you have to do is get to a repeater or a hotspot, and you can talk to a repeater or a hotspot somewhere else in the world, as long as the internet's up.
Everybody operates. Before you were talking about like packet radio, like network, like mesh networks and stuff that people would run. Does anybody's run DMR over those networks? So then,
I don't know. You could.
then you could have a kind of an under layer in case you lost, you know,
All right.
big gateways and stuff.
And the closest, well, okay. The closest D-Star repeater connected to the internet is in Orlando. There's like three of them fairly close together. They're about 40 miles. There's a D-Star repeater in Cocoa that may still support simplex, but its gateway's down, so it doesn't connect to the internet. There's a DMR repeater in Cocoa and I think Titusville. There's a Yaesu repeater for Fusion with the PCARS Club in Melbourne. My understanding is they only put it in Fusion mode for their net. Otherwise, it's in analog mode. I don't know the reason for that, because it should support either at the same time, but maybe they have a configuration problem. And I mentioned hotspot. All a hotspot is a little digital voice modem card with a processor, typically a Raspberry Pi Pico or Zero, and it's set up as a simplex repeater. It's more of a gateway. I don't have class next week. they're fairly cheap. You can get the modem board off of Amazon for about $30. And all you need is a Pi Zero, which like $10 or $15. They work quite well. It's fairly easy to configure. You can set it up for any of those modes or all. You can have one set up that's doing all three modes. But you set it up basically as a simplex device where you talk and listen on the same frequency. What function is performed with a transceiver in a digital mode hotspot? Alpha. Yeah, the hotspot normally is a wireless connection to the internet. Okay. When you're setting up for any of these digital modes, when you're programming your radio, in addition to the normal frequency, the offset, tones, things like that you have to set up, there's additional items required. So for DMR and D-Star, they both require that you program your call sign. And as part of the thing, it gets checked that it's a valid call sign. In the case of DMR, it has a thing called a color code, which is a 0 through 31 value. It's basically equivalent to what we call PL tone or CTCSS, where you have to have that set to access the repeater. In the case of DMR, they throw in this color code, which is a number that has to match. Where they got the color, I have no idea. It has nothing to do with color, but it's an access code number. DMR also has the time slots. That's one of the big things that they push, why it's better than the rest, because there's 2 time slots. And you can essentially multiplex 2 transmissions at the same time through that channel. When you set up a hotspot, you can only use one of those time slots, and normally it's like time slot 2. I haven't seen the great advantage of having the 2 time slots, but the others don't. So that's one difference. If you're doing D-Star, you have to go on and register your radio with your call sign in their database. In all of these, they have these virtual groups that can be set up. They call them talk groups on DMR, where you can, and each of those has an ID number, and you can set up your own actually and get a number where when you link to that talk group, only the people in that talk group can hear you. So it's like setting up a private group, and there's ones set up, there's worldwide, there's local stuff, there's East Coast, there's US, there's different countries, there's hundreds of talk groups. I don't know, maybe 1,000 talk groups. Same thing is true for D-Star and Yaesu, only they call them reflectors. It's the same kind of deal. And then comes code plugs, which I hate. It's really just the information that you have to program into the radio. It got its name from back in the beginning with handy talkies, where companies, in order to maintain configuration, these actually had a physical plug that you plugged into the radio that programmed it. And those code plugs, were identified, and they, because they didn't want everybody to be able to use any frequency they wanted. They weren't certain people on this channel and so forth. So that's how they set up the code plugs. It kept its name, even though no radio today has a physical plug that you plug this information in, you program it. And normally it looks like a spreadsheet,
That's still
like Chirp, looks like a spreadsheet.
Mhm.
All of them, whether it's RT Systems or the stuff that comes from ICOM or whoever, they all look basically the same. You put in the same kind of information. And it just uploads that into the radio. Or you can do the same thing from the keypad, although it's very tedious.
That's still required to connect to commercial computers today, or?
Well, the code plug is just the information that you need to put in. So in order to talk to a repeater, somehow you have to have programmed or manually select the channel, the offset, the tone. If you're doing digital voice, then you got those other things you have to put in, like the talk group number, the color code, the time slot, the call sign. In the case of analog, you do the call sign. It's not automatic. In the case of digital voice, as soon as you key the mic, it sends your call sign.
And the FCC wants to make sure you understand that doesn't, it's your responsibility to still tell your call sign and everything.
So what is a talk group on a DMR repeater?
Wow.
Okay. What does a DMR code plug contain?
Bravo.
And code plugs are not unique to DMR. Code plug is the generic term for the information that you program in the radio, regardless of what radio or what mode.
So on DMR, because I've never done DMR, but are code plugs repeater and talk group specific, or do they give you a broad access?
No, the entire file.
Okay,
But yeah, it's
so once you get it, you can.
DMR is very convoluted.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to set up a specific channel for every talk group, regardless of whether or not you're accessing all those talk groups from the same hotspot or the same
Right.
repeater. You still have to have a separate, you have to set up a full different channel.
Because it has to send that ID for the talk group to connect.
And I mean, once you get it set up, it's really cool. I wish more people used it, but just getting it to where it's usable is a pain. And our conversation about this reminds me that I've got, there's a club member named Alan that I need to call back and he's trying to figure out how to use his. But when I contacted him before, I had my wife's family visiting from Trinidad. So I didn't really have much time to work with him.
So it's the access information to
Yeah.
access the repeater and a talk group. That's the only thing that's really different on a DMR code plug is it's got that extra information for the talk group and the color code that you wouldn't have in analog mode.
People usually post that online, trying to connect to a specific repeater. Or contact with usually.
How do you get code plug is a general question, right?
Yeah.
Where's the code plug come from?
Well, you can build it, or if you buy the AT878 UV2 Plus from Bridgecom and you buy their Skybridge hotspot, you can also purchase a code plug for $100.
And there's people that have done them and they'll share it. But yeah,
Well, that's why
it's not that hard to do. In the case of like DMR with the talk groups, I forgot where it is now, but you can download an entire listing of all the talk groups in the world and and sort them and organize them by state, country, whatever, and pick the ones you want. I mean, you probably don't want every talk group that exists. How is a specific group of stations selected on a digital voice transceiver?
Bravo.
You're gonna stick with that?
Huh?
You're gonna stick with that?
Well, it'd be Charlie then. Well, like maybe an automatic identification.
Yeah, remember CTSS just is an access code to the repeater.
So you'd have to be, it'd be Charlie.
CTCSS is subaudible for most people tone. Below what, 250 or 300 hertz, something like that.
The highest one.
240 something
225.
is about the highest that I've seen. But
So
yeah,
I can't hear that anymore, but I think I used to be able to.
might be the same frequency as my wife's voice.
Are those programs actually encrypted or are they just?
No, it can't be.
Oh, really?
That's one of the things we'll get to next week or week after of you can't send encrypted information in amateur radio except for talking to space station commands or controlling model aircraft. If there's any kind of encryption, it has to be a published protocol where somebody can decrypt it. So, you know, it has to be basically transparent that anybody could decode it if they want.
So in line with that, while you're not specifically encrypting, if you want to talk to somebody over DMR, and anybody that knows your DMR ID or your friend's DMR ID would be able to still listen. If you talk DMR ID, nobody's going to be able to find it, like I say, unless they know your numbers. But yeah, because that's very specific. You have to be able to tell it what to communicate with. So you're either communicating with a talk group or you're communicating with a specific DMR ID. So it does give it, and they're very specific. They say it does not make your communications completely private.
Right.
Somebody can stumble
Somebody could
upon it,
still. Yeah,
but yeah, you can still.
But in order to hear it, you know, if it was DMR, you have to have a DMR radio.
Right.
If you just have an analog, I mean, you may be on that same frequency on the same repeater, but you're going to hear some weird digital sounds. Okay, what's the purpose of a color code? Yeah, you have to match the color. I still don't know why it's color. Sounds cooler, I guess, than just a number. Which of the following must be programmed into a D-Star digital transceiver before transmitting? Alpha. Okay. When we talk about an HF base station, you usually have a lot more buttons and knobs and things to play with. One of the things is the ability to change bandwidth filters to match the mode that you're in, because you usually want to limit the bandwidth to the mode you're operating. If you're doing single sideband, you usually want a bandwidth filter down 3 kilohertz, 2800 hertz, something like that. If you're doing CW, you know, go down to 150 hertz. If you're doing FM, it's like 12 kilohertz wide, unless it's narrow band. So it allows you to select a filter to match whatever that is to reduce the signal to noise ratio. Because the wider the bandwidth is, the more of the noise floor you're picking up. So that average power is coming in relative to the signal itself. So that's why you want it as narrow as possible to maximize the amount of signal per noise. What's the advantage of having multiple receive bandwidth choices on a multi-mode transceiver?
The alpha. Permits monitoring several modes at once, selecting a separate filter for each mode.
Where'd you get that?
Well, it have to be Bravo then. Permits noise interference reduction by selecting a band
Right.
matching the mode.
You want to use a bandwidth matching the bandwidth of what's being sent, basically. So if you're single sideband, you want to, which is going to be in the 3 kilohertz range, you want a 3 kilohertz bandwidth receiver. If you're doing CW, you want it down very narrow, 150 or less. And usually, you'll have like a selection of 3 fixed filters. And in some cases, you can play with those. Like on the ICOMs I have, it has what's called passband tuning. So you actually have 2 bandpass filters and you can slide them back and forth and make it much narrower or wider or shift it.
It's kind of the way they changed the latest firmware revision for the Zygen G90. They changed the way they program the filters, and now it doesn't match what the title is for the knobs and buttons on the front, and everybody gets confused by it. But for people that buy that radio, which are people who are rookies, it works out better because there's less the fidget bits.
Okay.
You just have to figure out where to find it in the menu.
You're trying to, increase your signal to noise ratio and reduce the noise. Which of the following receiver bandwidths provides the best signal to noise ratio for single sideband?
A or C. Let's see.
And you'll do some double.
Right. So it'd be Charlie.
Charlie. Okay, there's another feature. If you do a lot of single sideband, it's called the RIT, R-I-T. Sometimes it's called a clarifier. I think from the old days. It's not labeled a clarifier anymore. It'll have a little delta T or RIT on it. It allows you to make a fine adjustment on the frequency of the receiver. So if you're talking to somebody and their frequency is off a little bit from yours, okay, or drifts a little bit, you can compensate for that with the RIT. And it's very important because in single sideband, since there's no carrier, there's no reference. You have to be tuned almost exactly to the right frequency for them to sound right. Otherwise, you get a change in pitch. And you definitely get, at one point, it sounds like they're in a barrel. And another point, it's real Donald Ducky. So.
Yeah, I use that all the time. If you tune your main tuning knob, you're tuning your transmit frequency as well, because they're bundled. You change your main dial, is changing the receive and the transmit, so you don't want to do that because you want to transmit on the same frequency. But I've got stations I've listened to that are very bassy and they're harder to interpret. So I use the incremental tuning there, and you can change it so you can just understand them better. And that doesn't change your transmit frequency. So you're still where you're supposed to be. So I use that all the time.
It's basically an offset control for the receiver. to offset the frequency. Which of the following controls could be used if the voice pitch of a single sideband signal returning to your CQ call seems too high or too low?
Delta.
Delta.
Many of the rigs do have a XIT, which is transmit incremental tuning.
Right.
So you can leave your receive frequency, what's on the display, and change your transmit. I don't know.
On the 7300, I think was the now they marked the Delta T.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in all cases, you're going to have some form of a push to talk switch. It's fairly obvious on a handy talkie. You have a button on the side, you press it, and it puts it in transmit mode. And really, it's switching the antenna between the transmitter or receiver and the transmitter. Both of them at the same time. It's not good for the receiver to put a lot of watts into the front end. But essentially all it is a switch that usually controls a relay that switches that. And the kind of standard is that you ground the connection in order to make it switch to transmit mode. It defaults to receive mode. So what's the function of a transceiver's push to talk input?
Well,
And when you're in digital modes, the computer is handling that function. Okay, it automatically puts it in transmit mode and then starts sending audio tones to represent the symbols.
so some of these radios can be activated by voice.
Yes, called Vox.
Yeah.
It's voice operated transmit. Does the same thing, except it detects your voice at a certain level and will put it in transmit mode. Problem is background noise could key it also.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Plenty of discussion on mobile radio between husbands and wives. It probably should not have been on the air.
Mhm.
okay, so digital modes, we talked about hotspots a little bit. They're kind of cool although you need a digital mode radio in order to make use of it. But around here, if you wanted to do digital voice, other than having somebody else with a radio to talk to, you need a hotspot because there aren't any repeaters close enough for most cases, especially on D-Star and Yaesu. DMR has talk groups, and we talked about what those were. You have to supply the ID code for the talk group you want to link to. Like I said, they're called reflectors on the other modes. The code plug is just a weird name for the information that you have to put in, the access information, the frequency offset, tones, color codes, all that stuff. And in D-Star, you've got to have your call sign programmed in the radio because it automatically sends it as soon as you key it. It will send your call sign and you can have some additional text. Usually you put your name or your location or something, and that gets transmitted as like a header. You need to select the appropriate bandwidth filter when you're looking at HF transceivers for the various modes so that you can get the best signal to noise ratio by matching the filter to the mode. You can use the RIT control to vary the pitch of your receive frequency if it's off. And the push to talk is just what enables the transceiver in transmit mode by basically enabling the transmitter and switching the antenna to the transmitters. side of the radio. So